A lonely billionaire seal visits his mother's grave and discovers an envelope resting on the headstone. Curious, he opens it and he freezes in shock. It's a picture of him as a baby, standing next to two other identical little boys, and there's a note that it leaves him speechless. Forgive me for the secret I kept. Before we begin, let us know where you're tuning in from in the comments, and don't forget to give this video a thumbs up to support the channel. Now, just sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. So, Julian pulled up the black Mercedes just a short distance from the main gate of the cemetery and turned off the engine, but he just sat there, hands resting on I'm just sitting here, looking out the windshield at the wheel, and there's this thin mist hovering just above the grass. It's funny how 10 years can feel like just yesterday, and yet also like it happened to someone else entirely. He hadn't. It had been over a year since he visited, not because he forgot, but because he just couldn't bring himself to stand in front of a headstone and imagine it signified closure when he finally stepped out, his shoes sinking slightly into the wet earth. The morning was quiet. Like, really quiet, you know? The kind of quiet that just feels heavy. He strolled down the well-known path, passing by rows of names that didn't ring a bell, until he arrived at a shiny gray slab with her name on it. Margaret Vale, 1957 to 2015, etched in a crisp serif. His beloved mother had the flowers he sent every month, all trimmed and neat. It seems like someone from the grounds crew did a pretty good job replacing them, but honestly, they just felt empty. No scent, no personality at all. Julian stood there for a few seconds, and then he noticed something that seemed a bit off at the base of the stone leaning next to the roses was a faded pale yellow envelope. A bit worn, but his name was written across the front in handwriting he recognized instantly. He crouched down and picked it up, brushing off a few specks of dirt. No postage, no. Julian had a steady grip as he returned the address, but then he slid his thumb, and things changed a bit. Inside the flap, there was a photo that was creased right down the middle, and the colors had faded over time. The corners were soft from age, revealing 3 newborns all snug in their matching blankets. They were all lined up in a hospital bassinet. 3 identical little ones, all one of the. There was a little ink circle around the baby's face, and next to it, in faint writing, was the name Julian. He found himself staring at it longer than he intended. On the back of the photo, there was a note in the same handwriting. 5 words, forgive. I kept a secret from Julian. And he didn't budge as the breeze began to stir. He stood there on the grass, completely frozen, his knees stiff, and the letter still clutched in his hand. His mom had mentioned he was an only child more times than he could even remember. Just the 2 of them in a rented apartment in Boston, no aunts, no uncles, no cousins, living off their savings and putting in long hours. At the diner where she worked, nobody ever talked about siblings, much less anything like this. He placed the letter down. He got back in the car, brushing the dirt off his slacks. He took out his phone and called Nah. Busy? What do you mean by busy? She asked. Whether you're just pretending to be busy or actually swamped, I really need you at my place right now. Yeah, there was definitely a pause. On my way, he just hung up without giving any explanation. Sheesh. He didn't need a reason. Nah. He had been his assistant for 7 years, sharp, loyal, and all that. The only person who could tease him during board meetings was already at home by the time he got back. So, I'm just chilling on the couch with my laptop and a half-eaten protein bar. And I went ahead and rescheduled your lunch with the Swedish investors. She mentioned that she told them you were emotionally unavailable, and they actually nodded in agreement. Julian just stood there, not laughing. He handed her the envelope silently. She took it, opened it up, and she slowly pulled out the photo. Okay, wow, she said after a moment. Is this real? I'm just trying to figure that out. She glanced at the note. Your mom wrote this. Julian nodded and headed over to the bar. He poured himself a whiskey, even though it was barely noon. I thought you were an only child, so. Did I? Nah, I just sat quietly, which is rare for me. She looked at the photo again. These babies. They're identical, I get that, and you know one of them. So, who the heck are the other 2? Julian didn't say a word. He just knocked back the whiskey and headed into his office. Nah. She followed, still holding the photo. What do you want to do? He pulled a locked file box from the bottom drawer and set it on the desk. Inside, there were a few personal documents, including some of his mother's things, like old bills, her will, and hospital paperwork. He laid out the bracelet from the day he was born and started digging through her things. So, the birth records show me as the only child born on that day. Is it possible for those to be changed if? She watched him flip through the pages, scanning each one with practiced speed. When you know the right people, anything can happen. He said there's nothing here, no mention of another birth, no record of multiple births. Just me? Nah. Tap the photo. This wasn't taken in some back alley. This is at the hospital. He nodded and said, we need to talk to her lawyer. She must have left something. 2 hours later, they found themselves sitting across from David Callow, a man in his. Margaret Vale's attorney for most of her adult life, who was in their 60s, mentioned that she left no amendments to the will, he said, just the original version that you already have. What? What are the instructions about? Julian asked. Is there anything unusual? She hesitated to call. I did ask for one thing, a really specific request. I wasn't sure if it would make a difference. After all this time, Julian leaned forward. What was it that the lawyer opened up? She took out a thin sheet of paper from the folder and asked me to put an envelope on her headstone exactly 10 years later. Nina looked at Julian after her death. He was just so still. Why didn't she say anything? It would totally make sense to the person who found it. Julian was walking over to the. His hand rested on the windowsill, tapping once then. She knew I'd find it twice. The lawyer didn't answer on the ride back. Julian. They didn't say a word until they pulled into the garage, then killed the engine and turned to him. So what now? He glanced at. Her tired voice said, I need more than just a note or a photo. Na tilted her head. So, you're planning to start digging, huh? I have to later that evening. She showed up at his door with a small brown box and said she found something. As I handed it to him, I noticed it had some of your mom's receipts in it. It seems like she made a payment. There's a maternity home that operates on a cash basis, and while there's no official record, the address is still available. So, Julian opened the box. And inside he found a faded invoice from Rose Hill Home 4. Mothers have never heard of it, but it's still there in Westbridge, It's about an hour from here. He looked at the paper for quite a while before folding it up neatly and slid it into his pocket. Let's go. The drive to Westbridge was pretty quiet. Except for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional sigh from Julian as he gazed through the windshield. The late afternoon light spilled across the narrow two-lane road in front of them, with endless rows of bare trees lining both sides. Branches were all tangled up like veins, and there it was, the box with the maternity home receipt, sitting right in between. He and Nina were hanging out, and every now and then, he would glance over at it, almost like he was waiting for it to just open up by itself and reveal something to him. I don't know. Maybe there's something more we could work with, she said, eventually glancing away from him. Just act like it was all a strange coincidence. Get rid of the photo, throw away the note, and move on. Closure. He didn't answer, and honestly, she didn't expect him to. They reached the building just as the sun was setting, and what used to be Rose Hill Home for others had transformed into a community center with a fresh coat of paint. Hey babe, there's this paint job and a worn-out plastic banner that's promoting free flu shots. Just a few things to check out. Kids were kicking a soccer ball in the field next door, and inside, someone was playing the piano, maybe a bit off-key, but it had a cheerful vibe, just like Julian. He hesitated at the door, his hand resting against the glass, but then he stepped past him and pulled it open. Let's see if we can find someone who looks old enough to remember Nixon. Inside, the air had a subtle scent of floor wax mixed with old paper. The front desk was. There's a teenager in a hoodie, casually chewing gum and scrolling through her phone. She barely looked up when Julian asked about the building's history. You'll want Mrs. Penrose, she said, pointing down a hall. The back office, probably through the third door, had someone napping. The hallway was lined with cheerful decor. Posters about food drives and after-school tutoring really contrasted with what they were here for, making Julian's chest feel tight. He knocked gently on the door, waited for a moment, and then heard a voice, raspy but clear, say, "Come in." The office was a bit cramped, filled with various items, and had a subtle hint of lavender in the air, giving it a cozy vibe. A woman sat behind a desk that was stacked high with manila folders and paperbacks, her hair was pulled back in a bun that was starting to fall apart, and her reading glasses dangled from a cord around her neck. Julian stepped in first, Mrs. Penrose. She looked up and tilted her head. squinting at him for a moment before a slow, surprised smile formed. Well, look at you. Look just like her. Na raised an eyebrow. Like who? Margaret Vale, she said, the lovely girl with the 3 little angels. Julian's breath caught. He hadn't mentioned his mother's name yet. You remember her? Mrs. Penrose sat back, folding her hands. She was young, probably around 17, and had a quiet, polite demeanor. She was terrified but still managed to be brave, giving birth to 3 boys. She cried for days after he stepped forward slowly. She raised one hand and said, her voice gentler now, while the other 2 were placed in a closed position. Adoptions really broke her heart, but she just couldn't see another way. She pleaded for it. Privacy was a big deal. No one could know. Not even the boys themselves. Julian took a seat. He leaned heavily in the chair across from her, but he stayed standing with his arms crossed, studying her. Julian said she looked at the room like it might reveal more answers, but she never shared anything with me. Not once did she say that Mrs. Penrose wouldn't have replied. She made me promise to never. She mentioned it was the only way she could feel okay with herself, and I just kept listening. That promise, huh? I guess the silence that came after says a lot. Stretched thin, Julian stared at the floor, one hand gripping the arm of the chair. He felt something under his skin. It was sharp and rising, but he pushed it down. Anger wouldn't help, not here. You know? So, where did they go? I asked her in a more professional tone. Is there anything we can track down? Mrs. Penrose hesitated, tapping her fingers together. It's been over 30 years. I don't have access to those records anymore, and even if I did, the adoptions were sealed legally, so I can't share that with you. Julian's name was on her mind, not even just the initials. She watched him closely, as if wondering if he truly deserved the little she could give. I might recall a few things she mentioned, slowly at first. A boy went to a couple in Vermont, and I think their last name might have started with an E. I think the mother was single and from somewhere around Albany or something like that. I can't say for sure. But she pulled out her phone and started jotting down notes about anything. Hey, can we talk about the birthdays, details, allergies, and Mrs. Penrose? Smiled a little. And all 3 of you had those same cute dimples. That's what sticks with me the most. The nurses just wouldn't stop chatting about it, and Julian was at a loss for words. My whole life has been shaped by being the only one, the only child, the only person who really understood what was going on. Growing up in that tiny apartment was something else, especially with a mom who juggled 3 jobs, but still made time to braid his hair. So, I was doing my hair before school, and then suddenly, the image just broke apart. Like 2 brothers splitting up. Somewhere out there, someone might be living a life that's better than yours, while others could be having a tougher time. It's a mixed bag, really. He suddenly stood up and reached into his coat pocket, surprising complete strangers around him. He pulled out his checkbook and said, I'm not trying to bribe you, but if anything else comes up, I'd really appreciate a call. Just need some names, addresses, and doctors. Mrs. Penrose waved. I don't want your money. I've kept your mother's secret for decades. But maybe it's time someone stopped pretending those boys didn't exist. She jotted something down on a scrap of paper and gave it to him, a name of the doctor who took care of the adoptions. He's retired now, but Julian still lives in town, and he just nodded. Nah, she followed him out, her heels clicking on the pavement. They clicked on the tile and didn't say a word until they were back in the car, so she glanced over at him and said, Triplets? That's wild. When he didn't respond, she tapped him. Her fingers were on the dashboard. You okay? No. Well, great. That saves me the trouble of. He finally glanced at her for just a moment, but she didn't give away anything at all. Once in 33 years, she was probably scared that you'd hate her. He just stared straight ahead. Ahead? I'm not quite sure what I'm feeling yet. Nina reached into her coat pocket and pulled. Hey, remember that small notebook I told you about? It's the one that has the details about P.I., the person who used to date my sister's roommate owes me a favor and a Rolex. I shot him a text from Penrose's office. He's ready to dig. Julian blinked. Well, I didn't want to wait for that. You can work through your feelings really quickly. We've got initials, cities, and a hospital name that's. He leaned back in the seat and closed his eyes, thinking about something he could start there. For the first time in ages, he didn't feel the need to be in control. He just wanted some answers. Fine, he said. Let him dig. Nah, just put the car in gear and pull them back onto the road while the sun dips behind the trees, casting those long shadows. The report came in on a Thursday, stretching out like fingers. 3 weeks after their visit with Mrs. Penrose, Na just handed it to Julian without saying anything. I just set it on his desk and waited. He didn't open it right away. He just looked at it. The envelope looked like it could burst open at any moment. When he finally managed to pull the file out, it turned out to be thinner than he had anticipated, just a few pages. Pages that have a weight to them, the kind that can still crush you, the investigator had. I came across one of them, Elliot R. Evans, a former high school teacher who lived in a small place. There was a town in Vermont that had a real passion for literature. They even ran a drama club that was well known for mentoring students. Sadly, he passed away 5 years ago. He was in a car accident while heading home from a parent-teacher conference. He was alone. And the weather had been pretty bad. Julian didn't say much. He just read the file all the way through and then set it down. He just stood there, staring at it as if it might change on its own if he gave it enough time. Nah, he leaned against the doorway with his arms crossed. He crossed his arms and asked, "You okay?" He gave a small nod, barely noticeable, then reached for. A quick search on his computer led him to a school website with an archived staff page. There he was, Elliot thought. The resemblance was just incredible. Not only in the face, but also in the posture and the way his tie hung. It was crooked just like Julian's usually was, unless Nina managed to fix it. And then he found it was a wobbly cell phone video of a graduation ceremony. Elliot stood at the podium, with the gym behind him all decked out in blue streamers and folding chairs. The camera was a bit shaky. Elliot looked a bit nervous at first when I zoomed in too much, but then he relaxed after I corrected it. I used to think teaching was all about the curriculum, he said. His voice steady yet warm. Then I met a student who. He showed up to class every day, late and loud, and with absolutely nothing. I was about to throw in the towel on Shakespeare. But then one day I decided to ask him. He mentioned that he didn't care about much, but he really enjoys stories where people don't give up. A small ripple of laughter spread through the crowd as Julian settled back in his chair. Elliot smiled in the video, pushed his hair behind his ear, and his mannerisms felt not just similar, but really familiar. Elliot kept grinning, somehow knowing he passed English with a B-, but Julian passed teaching with an A that year. And the room erupted in applause. But he just stayed still, not moving at all. I watched the whole video twice, and then I went through it a third time from start to finish. He sat in silence for a long time, and the lights in the office dimmed. He kept moving outside the city, but inside, the silence thickened around him. He didn't pack up, he just carried on. He stood up and walked out, leaving his jacket on the back of his chair. He didn't call for the car, and he didn't tell Na where he was going. She found him an hour later at a diner off Fifth Avenue, the kind of place that still had booths with cracked vinyl seats and coffee served in shipped mugs. He was sitting by the window with a half-eaten grilled cheese and a glass of water. Of all the places to spiral, she said as she slid into the booth across from him. You really picked the one with the worst fries in Manhattan. He didn't smile, but something in his shoulders relaxed. Did you catch it? She asked. He nodded 3 times. And she raised an eyebrow. He was better than me. He seemed doubtful, but he was actually kinder and warmer. He did something that really mattered to you. I built a company that employs thousands of people, and it's definitely not the same. No way. It's not that it doesn't matter, but he just didn't respond right away. The waitress swung by and left some extra napkins, giving them a curious glance before heading off. Julian started poking at his sandwich. It's kind of odd, you know? I've spent my whole life steering clear of people. I kept things straightforward, just me. Job the occasional charity event so the board stays happy, and this demonstrates. Hey, I just found out about this brother I never knew I had, and now he's already gone. Can you believe it? Nah, I just stirred her coffee. With the handle of her fork, you didn't miss him on purpose. He just was never around. The map doesn't mean he didn't matter to you. He nodded slowly, and she leaned forward. So, what do we do now? Call it a sad ending and just move on? Julian pulled out a second page. So, from the report, there's another name that caught her attention. Damien lived in upstate New York. The investigator checked the information against others of the same age. So, the hospital dates line up with the adoption agency records, and this one is still matching up. Alive? Nah. I took the page from him and scanned it. Damien. What does Damien Langley do in retail? So, I was laid off recently and have been bouncing around jobs. A few months back, I even got evicted. It's been a bit of a ride, to say the least. A low whistle escaped as Julian took a sip of water and leaned back. He lives 2 hours from here, huh? She tilted her head and asked. So, when do we show up? But he didn't answer. He quickly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the photo again, the one from the envelope with 3 babies. 3 blank slates. I want to see him, but not like this, not with cameras and suits. And bodyguards. I'm just curious to see who he is and what kind of life he's had. She looked. Wait, are you really saying you want to handle this like a normal person? That's surprising. She smiled, and that might actually be the craziest part of all. So, Julian folded the photo and tucked it away. We'll go tomorrow, right? Nah. She tapped her fingers on the table. You planning on blending in? Because you've got billionaire written all over you. Your cufflinks are honestly worth more than this whole building. I'll just wear jeans, you know? You don't own any jeans? Then I guess we're going shopping. She groaned. You're lucky I actually care. Julian didn't say much about you, but I noticed the corner of his mouth pulled just a bit. They paid the check with a hint of a smile, stepped back into the chilly night, and started walking toward the car together for the first time since the graveyard. The silence between them felt different, not heavy. Just full. Julian drove this time, and Nina saw it as a sign of progress or maybe a cry for help. Help? He was tense behind the wheel, his shoulders locked in place like he was gearing up for a fight. And the city they were driving toward felt like the battleground. It was pretty quiet, mostly a residential area, you know, the kind of place with chain diners and a bit of a faded charm. Billboards 2 hours outside of Manhattan felt like a whole different planet. They hadn't seen anything like it. Not much has been said since the diner. Some things just don't need commentary. Like Elliot's absence. It was still fresh between them, and Julian was carrying it like a second skin. Damien lived in a 3-story house that it had turned into those apartments, you know? The ones where the paint's all peeling and there are long curls everywhere. Plus the recycling bins were always overflowing. So, I was just overflowing with excitement. I actually found the address by digging through property records and then cross-checked it with a social media profile that hadn't been updated. It had been a year since the last update. And from there, it was just a quick drive to the bookstore. I parked across the street and waited. Julian hadn't really mentioned how he wanted this to go. He just sat there with the engine off. I'm just watching the entrance, feeling unsure about this. Nah, I asked without even looking at him. Everything's good. That's how you can tell it's real. Just after 11, Damien showed up. And he was wearing a faded green jacket and with earbuds in, moving with that familiar tiredness of someone who's done this before. He walked daily, not checking his phone or glancing around, just unlocking the. Julian stepped through the front door of the shop and slipped inside, letting out a slow breath. That's him. They hung around for a few minutes before heading in. The bookstore had this cute little bell that jingled when they walked through the door. The smell of dust and old paper hit them right away. Damien was standing behind the counter, holding a steaming mug. As he flipped through a paperback, he looked up and smiled in that effortlessly relaxed way that some people just seem to have from the start. How can I help you find anything? Julian strolled over to his shelf, not saying a word, and grabbed a book at random. Just pretending to read the back cover, I ended up drifting toward the fiction section while keeping an eye on both of them, Damien. So, I just came out from behind the counter, and if you're into thrillers, this one is more about the talk than the action, kind of like a mystery, you know, that never really sorts itself out. Julian flipped it shut and smiled faintly. Good to know. Try this instead. Damien reached over and swapped the book for another one that had fewer plot holes and was better writing, and by the end, no one's a secret alien, unless you're talking about metaphors. Julian nodded, flipping through the pages. You've been working here for a couple of years, huh? It really depends on how generous the owner is feeling. Julian studied him closely. It wasn't just the face that showed the resemblance, it was also the way they carried themselves. Damon spoke slowly but with a keen edge, as if he was waiting to see if he could pick up on the hidden meaning. Same build, same jawline, he could definitely see it. Julian could have looked different if he had spent his younger years in the sun instead of in suits, right? Just imagine that. So, Damon asked if you're passing, but it wasn't exactly clear. We've got a local author event this Friday, and guess what? There'll be free coffee and some bad poetry to enjoy. It seems like some enthusiastic folks are trying to hide their disappointment. But Julian cracked a smile, which feels just about right. He went ahead and bought the book. Damon called him up and added a little bookmark for free. Julian thanked him for it, stepped outside without looking back, and then a minute later, they followed with a face that was hard to read. So once they were back in the car, Julian went ahead and started the engine. But he didn't really do much after that. Driving, he's totally different from what I pictured, and in a really good way. He took his time thinking things through. They drove in silence for a bit until Julian decided to pull into a nearby parking lot. He didn't move for a few seconds and then said he was kind. I didn't do anything to deserve that. Earn it. But he was just leaning back in her seat. You're talking like you. I thought he might throw a chair at you, honestly. I'm not sure what I was expecting. He just stared down at the book in his lap. But it was something else. Wasn't this you? You felt something, didn't you? He didn't answer right away. It was like he sensed something, not really on purpose. But there was this part of him that looked at me and just didn't flinch, like we were familiar. Sounds suspiciously like a feeling, she said. I knew you had one tucked away in there. He didn't take the bait, though. He just turned the key and drove off again. I spent the next couple of days just quietly observing the little moments of Damon's life as they unfolded. Damon lived on the second floor in a unit he shared with an older guy who worked nights and was hardly ever around. He cooked simple meals, sometimes on his way to work. He took the long route through the park to enjoy his meals. One night, he was at the discount store getting groceries and ended up staying late, rearranging the shelves and having a good chat. I was chatting with a regular customer who came in with her kid, and it looked like the kid really took a liking to him. Julian kept an eye on everything from afar, and the more he observed, the quieter he became. So, I found out from public records that Damon had actually enrolled in college 2 times, but ended up dropping out both times. The first time was to take care of something for a foster mom dealing with early dementia, and then again after he lost his job at a restaurant that shut down, which he didn't own. A car, no criminal record. No big moves, just a guy who had quietly made it through. Julian didn't say much about the 1,000 small setbacks. He just kept going. He kept showing up on the 3rd day when he went back into the bookstore. This time, it was Damien. A teenage girl was covering his shift since he's off today, so he wasn't behind the counter. She mentioned she'd probably be back tomorrow. Julian thanked her and went ahead and bought a book anyway. The next day, Damien was there, and he looked a bit surprised when Julian walked in. Then he smiled, as if it was just a coincidence that he was there. Happy to see you again, he said. Let me guess, you finished the last book and I need a refund. Julian just shook his head and said no. I walked in a few minutes later. Later, with her phone in hand, she paused when she saw the two of them. Damon glanced over. As they exchanged glances, the realization began to settle in. Okay, he said, moving around This is the 3rd time I've seen you in a week. Either you're stalking me or we've met before, Julian said. Damien waited with his arms folded loosely, not responding right away, but his tone remained light. But you could feel it. Something in the air had changed. There was less banter now, and more weight to everything. The moment lingered, not exactly tense but definitely charged. Julian opened his mouth, but nothing came out yet. Damon raised an eyebrow. Well, Julian finally spoke, his voice breaking the silence. Low. It's complicated. Damien nodded slowly. Isn't it always? Damon didn't push. He just mentioned that we should chat, and then led me to the shop for an explanation. Julian stepped outside, passing by the crooked row of bookshelves and the girl at the counter who hardly glanced up at the street. By then, the early evening shadows were stretching long across the pavement, and Julian followed along without a word. He took his steps slower than usual, as if each one made everything feel more real. They paused at a bench right across from the bookstore. Damien fished a pack of gum out of his pocket, unwrapped a piece, and Damon glanced over and said, I offered one to Julian, but he declined. So what's this about? You know, that poetry night I keep telling you about. Julian pulled a photo from his coat pocket and passed it over. Let's get straight to the point, just the truth in one image. Damien unfolded it and just stared for a long time, not saying a word. His expression was something else. He didn't change much, but the vibe around him did. Finally, he let out a soft sigh, breath, and said, So I guess I wasn't just a weird-looking baby after all. Julian waited, Damon turned the photo over and read the note on the back. "Forgive me for the secret I kept." He read aloud. "Well, that's pretty vague and not really helpful at all. I came across it on her grave a few weeks back. Julian mentioned she had left some instructions with it. Her lawyer decided to put it there a decade after she passed." Damon looked up, and she's. So he folded the photo carefully and handed it back. "You're Julian, right?" Julian nodded once. "And I was just as clueless. She never mentioned it." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Just the two of us, growing up together. With her working nights and everything. It was all about those moments, you know? I would catch a glimpse of her in the mornings, and if I was lucky, she always made sure I had everything I needed. But there were things missing, things I didn't realize were missing until recently." Damien nodded slowly. "Yeah, I had some of that too. There were a lot of foster homes. Some were good. Some not so much, but there was one really great one she passed through. Years ago, they just sat there quietly for a few minutes." Julian took his time, not rushing Damien. He didn't ask many questions yet. Eventually, he stood up and said, "Come on, I'm starving." So this kind of chat really calls for some affordable takeout and a good dose of caffeine. They found themselves at a cozy little diner on the outskirts of town. Red booths, cracked laminate menus, and coffee that was probably older than the waitress. They ordered burgers and fries. They sat across from each other in a booth that wobbled if he leaned the wrong way. Julian shared how he found. So, the photo that the lawyer, Mrs. Penrose, mentioned was about Elliot, the brother they talked about. Never got to meet Damon. He went quiet at that part and stirred his drink for a bit. "So, I used to think about whether I had a twin, not really seriously or anything. But it crossed my mind. Sometimes, I'd look in the mirror and feel like something's just not quite right. It felt kind of silly, you know? I thought it was just one of those things you eventually outgrow." Julian didn't say anything. He just picked at his fries for a bit. "Must have been nice," Damon chimed in. Julian mentioned that growing up with just one name, one room, and one set of rules felt pretty lonely. "And it doesn't mean I'm better than you. I never said that. I'm just pointing it out. There are gaps in me that I never knew how to fill." The food came, and they ate in relative quiet. Now and then, Damien asked. Julian's life, his company, the penthouse, the travel, Julian answered. Honestly, without any pride, it just wasn't the right time for that. After dinner, we grabbed some coffee to go and strolled through the neighborhood. Damien pointed out his favorite mural and the best spot for late-night hangs. Julian was at the grocery store late at night, grabbing some tacos. The cashier, who always hooked him up with discounts on expired milk, was there as usual. Julian listened while he stored it all away. All the details would really help him get a clearer picture of Damien's life. They wrapped up the night back at the Damon at the bookstore unlocked the door and welcomed Julian inside. He then showed him the upstairs room, where Julian flopped down on a pull-out bed. He just couldn't get any sleep at the apartment. There were stacks of books all over the place, totally unorganized, and a small record player was sitting there too. In the corner, next to a chipped mug filled with change, Julian looked around and said, "This is yours." Damon smiled. "It's mine for now," she said softly. After that, they began to see each other more often, starting with lunch every few days. So they spent their days hanging out, then went for walks and had nights out. One time, they even went to a batting cage where Damien decided to hide, just sitting there for 5 minutes with nothing but air, and then he finally connects and acts like he just hit the jackpot. Classic Julian. We really laughed that day. It was loud and unexpected. Afterward, they decided to hit up a dive bar where Damon was all about ordering They decided to try the worst drinks on the menu just to see how far they could push Julian. By the end of it, they both left feeling buzzed and a bit unsteady, half drunk on the experience. Damien often joked about the absurdity of it all, saying, "Call Julian a Bond villain for his wardrobe." He said Julian looked like someone who paid extra to avoid eye contact when he showed up one day in jeans and sneakers. She clutched her heart and said, "I didn't realize this reunion came with the miracles they talked about." Julian shared bits and pieces about his mother, never revealing everything at once. He talked about her hands, how she would sing while cooking, and how she once got him a bike using her tip money and left it right outside the door, all wrapped up with a ribbon made of napkins. Damien didn't. He had stories like that, and he listened as if he wanted to memorize every single one. One night, while sitting on a bench by the river, Damon said. I feel like a ghost. It finally came together. Like I was just drifting through someone else's narrative. Julian. I looked out at the water. You're not a ghost. You're the part of me I didn't know I missed. Damien didn't say anything. Right away, he said, You always talk like a guy who's got a script. Julian. I smiled as I rehearsed before leaving the house. You really should stop. It's exhausting. Hey, just listening to you. Julian turned toward him and asked, Want to come with me to the... Just a few days at the lake house, and it's so peaceful. No signal, no cameras, just plenty of space to breathe. Damien thought about it for a moment. So, you're saying a cabin in the woods with a guy I just met who says we're related, Julian? Damien smiled and shrugged. Could be worse, right? He said it like a kid who's just been invited to his very first sleepover, and for the first. Julian felt something like hope for the first time in years, not the kind that comes from results. Planning or numbers on A. Just a simple scene to start with, the lake house nestled under the tall trees. At the end of a winding gravel road. There are pines that create a perfect spot for some peace and quiet. The dock reaches out into the water, inviting you to take a moment and just be. The water felt like a gentle invitation. And everything around it seemed to push the world away. Julian hadn't been there. In almost a year, it never really felt like a home, just a place to escape the noise when the pressure got too intense. But this time, it felt different. He wasn't running from anything. He was trying to. Damien stepped onto the porch like it was a familiar place, kicking off his shoes as if he belonged there. It felt like he was making space for something new. I wandered into the open kitchen, found the fridge, and called out, You've got 5 types of mustard and no milk? That's interesting. Julian smiled as he dropped his bag by the door, thinking about serial killer behavior. Hey, there's a grocery list on the counter, but guess what's missing? Milk. Did you forget? Or is it just that you drink your coffee black like a villain? They spent the first afternoon unpacking, but honestly, Damien brought so little that it hardly felt like a big deal. He moved around like someone who knew not to settle too deep anywhere. The second day they went fishing off the dock, even though Damien admitted he hadn't picked up a rod since he was 12. And all he managed to hook were weeds. He tangled the line so many times that they gave up on fixing it and just handed him another one. They grilled some cheap burgers and served overpriced steaks. We played some video games that Julian hadn't touched in years, and then we ended up staying up way too late watching old movies. Damon actually fell asleep halfway through. Julian stayed awake through every single one, not because he was restless, but because he didn't want to miss a thing. It took him over 30 years to find his brother, and he wasn't about to miss it now. Nah, he arrived on the 3rd day, and she rolled up in a rental car, rocking some oversized sunglasses and carrying a grocery bag with real milk inside. Damien met her on the porch, took the bag, and said, Thank you. The balance in this household was a bit off. You know? I looked at him and just nodded. You're the funny one. That's what I keep saying. Julian watched from inside as she seemed relaxed while talking around Damien, which made him wonder, not for the first time. Imagine what it would have been like if they all grew up together. Would it have been chaotic? Probably. But maybe it was the kind of mess that totally made sense that evening when Julian found Damien asleep in There's a chair on the back porch with someone sitting in it, head tilted and mouth slightly open. A book is resting on their chest, and the sunlight is hitting their face just right. Everything felt right and softening. He looked so peaceful. Julian just stood there for a long time. In that moment, he heard Na step beside him. He looks like me, he said, but lighter. Somehow, she followed his gaze. Maybe that's what you could have been if you weren't carrying so much. He didn't. He answered right away and said, The note's been stuck in my head since I found it. Forgive me for the secret I keep thinking about it. She did what she thought she had to do, you know? I get that, but I can't help but think if I let them both down just by being the one she chose. I have everything they have. You've got her guilt, her silence, her shame, but that's not the whole story, right? He rubbed a hand across his jaw, feeling like he inherited all this wreckage. And I had no idea what I was holding. Nah, she leaned her elbow on the porch railing. You didn't get picked, you got. He nodded. But it felt like he was left with a burden that just wasn't the same. She added something to the conversation, but it didn't quite change the mood. You're not failing him now. They hung out there until the sun went down, and Damien didn't wake up, just moved a little. In the chair, still holding the book as if he planned to finish it later that evening. The three of them decided to go for a walk along. The dirt path wrapped around the lake, and it was cool outside. A steady breeze was cutting through the trees. Damien strolled ahead with his hands in his pockets, occasionally pointing out birds or cracking jokes about the bugs being too much. He was all organized, and then suddenly, without any warning or hesitation, he just stopped moving. Julian. I caught up to him and called his name, but Damien didn't respond. He was just swaying there. He kind of wobbled a bit, then suddenly dropped to his knees quietly and fell over to the side onto the path. Julian shouted, "Nah," as she was already pulling out her phone. They rolled Damien. He was on his back, his face pale and his breathing uneven. Julian just kept talking to him. He called out his name, trying to pull him back with all his might. The ambulance took 15 minutes to arrive, and Julian rode it out. With him, Nina followed behind at the hospital, where everything felt a bit blurred, test scans and all. Julian sat in a plastic chair, feeling numb, while he heard the quiet updates from the folks in lab coats around him. As Nina paced the hallway, she was deep in a phone argument about insurance, while Damien was left without a doctor. They finally came out and said it was advanced lymphoma cancer. Julian stood there, undiagnosed and too late, and he missed most of the explanation. They used words like aggressive and spread, and there wasn't much time. They let him into the room once Damien was stable and awake, propped up with oxygen and already cracking a weak joke before Julian even made it to the bed. "Of course, the moment I track down my billionaire brother, I'm ready to make my move," Julian said. Beside him, with a thick throat, he said, "You're not going anywhere. Let's not start lying to each other." Julian shook his head and said, "I'll find someone. We're going to give it our all with the specialist trials." Damien reached for his wrist with his fingers. "I'm thin but firm. Don't waste your cash trying to freeze me. Just hold on to my hand." Julian didn't say a word. He just reached out and held it. Damien glanced over at him. "My eyes are tired but clear. You've given me more in just 3 weeks than I ever expected to get in the next 10 years. I'm not scared, just really mad. I didn't have more time to annoy you. And you're not going to die." Damien gave just a little shrug. "I might, and that's totally fine. I didn't say it was fair, but it is what it is." So, Julian just hung out with him all night. He didn't even check his phone or make any calls. "So, the office?" "Yeah, someone popped in once with coffee and then just left without saying much." The machines beeped steadily, keeping track of moments Julian wasn't quite ready to count. Damon lasted 3 weeks. They were both in this together. Julian experienced the longest and shortest weeks of his life, filled with both good days and some smaller ones. Damon had everyone in the room cracking up when he swiped some Jell-O from the patient fridge and started teasing Julian about how his button-down shirts gave him that vibe of a dad who'd misplaced his kid at Home Depot. And then there were the really unfortunate ones when he felt pain settle in deep and his jokes started to fade. The words just flowed out. Julian took his time leaving the hospital. He kept his phone on silent, and only Nina called and took care of things, bringing clothes and food, while the emails piled up unread. The meetings got canceled without any explanation, but the board would be just fine. He didn't really care. Damien never asked for more than what Julian was already giving. He didn't want miracles, just some presents. Some days we chatted for hours, but there were times when they just stayed quiet, letting the hum of machines and distant footsteps break the silence. On his last night, Damien was calm, too calm, like something had settled. He kept drifting in and out of sleep. He held Julian's hand tightly, as if he didn't want to lose track of who was right there with him. It was obvious when his breathing shifted, and the air in the room felt different, sharp and slow. Julian leaned in closer. He really didn't want to miss anything. Damien opened his eyes one last time and smiled softly. "You found me," he whispered. "That's enough. Now go find you." He was gone just minutes later. The funeral was small. Julian didn't say a word. He just sat in the front row next to Na. I barely blinked. The coffin was just plain wood, no flowers. That's how Damien wanted it, I thought. "Don't turn me into a Pinterest project," he said after Julian vanished. He left the lake house, not saying a word to anyone else, and headed back to the city. He just stopped moving for days. Then weeks. He drifted away. No calls, no texts, no sign of him. He lived a life that went beyond just keeping his name from being declared missing, spending most of his time at Damien's. The landlord let him in without any fuss. The place still had a faint scent of cheap coffee and old pages. Julian stumbled upon a pile of old video blogs on a hard drive that had never been published. It was quite a surprise. Damien began sharing his story, but then hesitated. He looked around at everyone, watching them as he talked. It was so strange waking up and feeling lost, like I didn't really know where I fit in. I remember laughing with Damon about those jobs that didn't stick and the crazy times with roommates. So, there's this girl who didn't pay her rent, right? She left a note and took all the forks. Can you believe that? Damien's got quite the story there. So, you're trying to talk about loneliness without being all dramatic, right? And then you start to wonder if maybe it's just you. Like that guy mentioned in one of his videos. Maybe you're the one who feels like nobody wants to fall into it. Julian definitely watched that one more than the others while he sat there. The couch had on Damien's hoodie, with sleeves that were too short and a hood that was way too big, almost like armor that just didn't quite fit him. He didn't cry much. He didn't rage either. He just existed. It was like someone who had lost the signal, just hanging around, hoping the static would clear up. But then, after a week of searching, I finally found him there. She walked in. Seeing the unanswered texts and the unwashed dishes, along with the half-eaten food. There was a sandwich on the counter, and the man she used to know was curled up on someone else's warm couch. At first, she didn't say anything. She just stood there. She stood there with her arms crossed, waiting for him to notice her. When he didn't, she crossed her arms even tighter. Julian looked up as he switched off the monitor in the room. You spent your whole life's about shutting people out, she said. Then you let one in, and now you're punishing yourself. It's about loving him, not about grief. It's more like fear. He didn't flinch. Just take a look. I'm so tired. He was my second chance, and I let him slip away. She said to do something with it again. Not just sit here like a ghost. I'm not the only one who lost him. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then leaned forward. With his hands clasped, he was better than me in all the ways I couldn't be. Lena said softly, it wasn't better. He was different. You were meant to carry things. He was made to feel them. You both got the short end. Julian didn't say anything. She did. I just sat down next to him without asking. It's okay to be broken sometimes. But you can't just vanish, not after everything, not after what he did for you. I sat still for a while. And then I just quietly thought, I really don't know how to fix any of this. I just don't. Fix it, she said. Live it. They didn't hug right away, but when they finally did, it wasn't quite what they expected. It was the kind of moment that felt a bit forced. Julian leaned into her, almost like a man who hadn't leaned on anyone in ages. She held him close. He just stayed there, not rushing or giving any advice, holding on for a long time. The moment she kissed his cheek, it wasn't for comfort or some hidden meaning. He turned his head slightly, and their lips met in a quiet moment of connection. It was brief and unannounced, and honestly, it didn't feel like a start or an ending, just a moment. It was a necessary pause in a life that had forgotten what it meant to be held. That night, he went home with her, and they didn't. They didn't say much at first, just lying side by side without touching. Then, slowly, their hands found each other, overlapping like something discovered in the dark, no passion, no pretense. Just the stillness wrapped around them, and the silence spoke volumes. No words were necessary. He drifted off to sleep before she did. She watched him breathe and stayed still. It had been just over 3 months since Damien passed, enough time for the sharp pain to settle in. The edges of grief started to wear down into something duller, yet still very much there. Julian moved differently now, slower in his actions. The mornings feel a bit quieter during meetings, and I'm less interested in arguments that didn't really matter. People definitely noticed. But not much was said, just a few board members. We talked a bit about burnout, and a couple of people awkwardly tried to express their sympathy about it. He experienced personal loss, but he let them talk. He had other things on his plate, and then the foundation came along. They came together quicker than anyone thought possible. The Vale Foundation for Lost Sons, Nina. I helped build it from the ground up, drafted the mission, wrangled the accountants, and worked with the community. Organizations that were already handling the tough stuff. Julian just wanted it to be simple, right? Gala no cameras, no oversized checks or ribbon cuttings. Just action, quiet and real. They consistently took action, focusing on young adults aging out of foster care, like Damien. who had slipped through the cracks. There were grants, housing stipends, and mentoring programs for those who never got the long-term support they needed. Therapy stipends were available for anyone who asked. The staff operated out of a simple office space near the East River, nothing fancy. There's just the right amount of space to get things done and plenty of light to keep people hanging around on the morning of the foundations. Julian was hanging out at the back of the room while the volunteers were busy setting up coffee and folding chairs. Na was chatting with someone. She was talking to someone about the signage, but she kept stealing glances at him. He wasn't really doing much, just watching. She didn't push the issue. The first group came in slowly, caseworkers, former foster youth, a few local advocates. There was no press, which had been the case. Julian was clear about one thing. He didn't want his name in the headlines. This wasn't about him at all. It was later that afternoon when everything was settled, and then he and Na left. She drove without saying a word, and he didn't ask where they were headed. He just knew. The cemetery looked just like it did the first day he stood there, envelope in hand, with the wind rustling through the trees. There's a soft rustle in the distance. They brought 3 chairs this time, one for him, one for. They put Nina's things on one chair. And on the third chair, they laid Damien's old green hoodie. The one Julian had kept still had a faint smell of cedar mixed with something cheap. There's a bar of soap next to a framed photo of Damien, grinning with his chipped front tooth. Squinting into the sun like he always did, he laughed harder than he intended. Julian didn't say anything at first. He just knelt beside. As I brushed away some dried leaves from the headstone, I noticed something tucked into the flowers that were already there. Another surprise waiting to be found. The envelope is smaller this time, with familiar handwriting and that same soft curve to the J in it. He opened it carefully, and inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. The ink was a bit faded, and the handwriting looked shakier than the last note he remembered. If you're reading this, it means my hope came true. You found them. You really found them. He didn't read it aloud. He just held it there, resting in his lap, letting it be. As he let the weight of it settle, he thought maybe he'd feel anger, regret, or grief. Just all of it, you know? Over again. But what showed up instead was something quieter, a kind of stillness. She thought we'd be upset, he mentioned eventually, but honestly, all I feel is. Feeling grateful, she didn't reply. Instead, she reached over and placed a hand on his arm, and they just sat there. So, for a bit, the 3 of them were just hanging out. Julian wasn't in a hurry to leave. He just stayed there. He glanced at his phone, then watched the breeze dance through the grass, letting it take whatever it wanted from him. The penthouse had its windows wide open, and you could really feel it. Spring had finally come and softened the air. Julian poured each of them a glass of wine, and they settled on the rooftop as the sun dipped, softening the skyline in the process. He said quietly, "I'm done hiding, done pretending I'm fine when I'm not. I'm done trying to run from everything." "No." I just leaned my head back, eyes half closed. "That's good because I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her, then really looked the way. He hadn't allowed himself to feel this way before all of this. She didn't just fill a void. She had been right there beside him. I just wanted to be there with him, without needing to be anything more than just present. I didn't. He just said he found my brothers, and I found you too. She didn't move right away, though. She leaned in slowly, resting her head against his shoulder while the city buzzed in the distance. "Let's not lose each other," she said, looking down at the distant and irrelevant things below them. He spoke softly, and he didn't answer, not because he didn't want to, but simply because he didn't. The words were already there, hanging in the quiet, just staying like that until the sun had set, and the city transformed into a shimmering sea of soft golds and twinkling lights. There was a gentle hum all around, something that felt almost alive. It was one of those evenings where traffic and noise didn't matter. It simply invited them to relax and enjoy the space to sit and unwind. Breathe and remember, the wind had picked up a bit, cool enough for Na to tug the blanket tighter around her legs. But she stayed right by Julian, not moving an inch. He hadn't said anything since she leaned into him, but honestly, she didn't need him to say a word for the moment to feel just fine. For the first time in months, maybe even years, Julian felt unguarded, not vulnerable. The way he'd always worried showed a weak but honest light. Like something had shifted inside him and created space for something better, yet there was still sadness. He knew there would always be that grief, but now there was something else too. quietly tucked beside it, steady and present. He thought about Damien every day, not with that intense feeling that used to take his breath away, but with a sense of gratitude. That really caught him off guard. He thought about all the laughter they had together, how Damien spoke as if he had known Julian for ages, even when he didn't. He found himself thinking about their last night in the hospital, the way Damien held his hand, completely unafraid, the way he smiled through the pain and said, "Go find you." Julian had no idea what that meant something back then, but now he wondered if maybe he did. He just wasn't the same man he used to be. A year ago, there was this guy who seemed to have it all but felt absolutely nothing. He went to his. Visiting my mother's grave feels more like a duty than a heartfelt gesture, especially considering the man who believed that control equated to true strength. So, this guy was slowly breaking things apart, and then, out of nowhere, someone else showed up, someone who wasn't in a hurry at all. To talk faster, to really listen, and to be courageous enough to stick with people even when it's tough. Damien had shown him that. In the short time they had, he gave Julian more than years of therapy or boardroom wins ever could. He gave him connection. It was a real messy, beautiful connection, and she had really anchored him through all of it. She witnessed his worst and chose to stick around. Instead of trying to fix or save him, she just kept showing up time and again. He held on to that belief for so long, thinking no one could really get close without eventually walking away. But then she came along, and she never left. She didn't flinch at all. She didn't try to fill the gap in him. She just stood there beside it, steady. He was stubborn until he figured out he didn't have to face everything by himself. They didn't need to label anything just yet. It was the closeness that brought comfort, her leaning against him, just being there in the moment. Softly the wine we shared, the grief we felt together, the hope we held for whatever was to come next. That was more than he'd ever asked for, more than he even knew he wanted. "I think I want." He mentioned going back to the bookstore, his voice dropping to a low tone, maybe to donate. There's something about his name, a reading room, and a scholarship for one of the kids who comes by. He shifted just enough to glance up. And he knew Julian would like that. He nodded. Yeah, he was moving slowly, just a few blocks away when a siren went off somewhere in the city. Someone was out there celebrating, shouting into the night. The world kept moving, but for just a moment, Julian had hit pause. Just long enough to soak this all in. He said he's not going to waste any of it. It wasn't the time we had, nor the people I found, and definitely not the second chance. I didn't even realize I was missing it. Needed? Nah, he took her hand. You're not. He turned to her, then really turned and he looked at her as if he could see the entire journey laid out before them, the loss hanging in the air, the love, the wreckage, the rebuilding. And her, always her, somewhere along every step. For a mile, she just held on to his hand, and he said, "If someone had told me, a year back, I had 2 brothers, and one of them had this way of making everything better just by being around for a few weeks, and I found myself falling in love with the one person who could call me out while also handing me a sandwich. He smiled and said, you would have fired me on the spot. I would have panicked. Then maybe they fired you." "Well," she said, stretching her, with her legs stretched out in front of her, "you didn't do it, and yet here I am," he said, pulling her closer. She leaned in closer to him, her hand reaching out gently as they both watched together. The lights blink across the skyline behind them. The world was still buzzing with noise and grief and impossible odds, but right now, in this moment, they were exactly where they were supposed to be, and for the first time in his life, Julian Vale. He wasn't looking for anything else. He wasn't reaching forward or glancing back. He was just here, having discovered what truly mattered, and if you enjoyed this story, I'd love it if you could leave a like. It really makes a difference. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more heartwarming and emotional tales, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Make sure to turn on notifications so you don't miss any uploads. I'd really like to know what you thought of this one, so feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. I appreciate your reactions, and I'll catch you in the next story.